All right, you guys, welcome to session 9, synthetic turf infill and studies from 11:15 to 12:15. After that, we'll go into lunch. So we have a little wiggle room in there, but at this point, I'd like to turn this over to CalRecycle's Emily Wong with our senior environmental scientist, who's going to moderate and present during this session. So we appreciate all of you doing that. Emily, take it away.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. So my presentation is actually going to be pretty short. I just want to give a little bit of background and context for these studies, since it's been a year since you guys looked at these before. So and they started way back in the day. So the environmental health studies with synthetic turf really got started by way back in the early 2010s, when a soccer coach in Washington noticed that she had a number of soccer players that seemed to have high incidences of cancer. And so this raised a lot of parental concerns about cancer, since a lot of soccer players were playing on these synthetic turf fields. So with enough concern, CalRecycle contracted with OEHHA to perform a study to assess the cancer risks and environmental health concerns from these turf fields. For a little bit of background, OEHHA had previously done some studies on synthetic turf fields and safety. They were mostly focused on more physical aspects, so things like bacterial growth on the turf compared to regular fields, risks of trip hazards and impact attenuation, those sorts of things. And then New York City and New York State had also done some studies, and the state of Connecticut had also done some studies, and nothing had, no risks and concerns that were significant were found. So OEHHA going in to this study was, and EPA as well, actually, we're now taking a more approach of, okay, what are the chemical concerns of dealing with these turf fields? And so we started these studies, and in the meantime, while this study has been going on since 2015, a number of different agencies around the world and around the country have performed their own studies. The Netherlands did a study. They pulled samples from all of the fields in the Netherlands. ECHA, the European Chemicals Agency, also did studies. National Toxicological Program did a study in vivo with mice, feeding them bits of crumb rubber. USEPA, clearly, is right here, and Yale University. And thus far, the concerns have been, they've sort of identified where some risks lay, but nothing, again, that raised to a level of significant, we should not use these turf. So that's sort of the background of what's been happening during the course of the study outside of OEHHA. And then, so that just lays, and I want to point out the cancer cluster study that Washington State did. It wasn't like an actual, they didn't do sampling or anything like that, but it was more just a study of cancer rates among different populations, and they didn't find that there was any increased cancer rate among the soccer players, former soccer players. And then, so that's some of the background that we're dealing with in people that have been looking thus far at the synthetic turf fields and health hazards. More recently, in the last few years, obviously, there's a couple other chemicals that have popped up, 6-PPD, which we just heard about, and PFAS. One, I want to mention that, I want to make it clear that a lot of the OEHHA study was designed, and actually sampling, all the actual sampling happened before the concerns with the PFAS and the 6-PPD arise. So none of the study design is really meant to capture impacts from these two chemicals. So I just want to sort of reorient everybody's focus, that the focus of these studies was more on the cancer causing issue. So we can't, it was not meant to address concerns with these specific chemicals. So that's really rough 2-minute outline of the context for these studies and what's going on. And in the meantime, I'd like to introduce our two speakers. We have Kannan Krishnan from OEHHA, and he will speak to us about the study a little bit, what OEHHA has been doing in the last few years. Kannan is the chief of the Air and Site Assessment and Climate Indicators Branch at the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment. He obtained his PhD in community health from the University of Montreal and is a diplomat of the American Board of Toxicology, where he's contributed he's contributed to many different panels and committees with the National Academy of Sciences, the International Program on Chemical Safety, the US EPA, and the International Agency for Research on Cancer. And then our second speaker, Annette Giuseppe Ely, she is from the US EPA. She's the National Program Director for the Chemical Safety for Sustainability National Research Program at the Office of Research and Development at US EPA. And the Office of Chemical Safety for Sustainability Office addresses chemical and health challenges posed by insufficient information on chemicals necessary for informed risk-based decision-making. So clearly a great fit for something like the studying turf chemicals. She is a fellow of the American Institute for Medical and Biological Engineering and has served as the EPA Science Management Lead for the Federal Research Action Plan on synthetic turf. So without any further ado, let's start with Kannan Krishnan. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Pleased to be here. To give you an update on the OEHHA study of health risks from crumb rubber and synthetic turf fields. Is this my? Okay, to advance. Thank you. All right, I learned something. Done for the day. Learning. In terms of learning, always something to learn. Let me start out maybe with a slide about OEHHA, Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment. We are the lead state agency for the assessment of health risks posed by environmental contaminants. Our mandate and activity landscape covers a number of things that I noted here, listed here: air toxics, hotspots assessments, Proposition 65 listing, public health goals for drinking water contaminants, Cal EnviroScreen tool for identifying communities highly burdened by pollution sources, human right to water tool, periodic reports of the indicators of climate change in California, peer review of pesticide evaluations, and operation of the biomonitoring California program, which is CDPH and DTSC. I think I said fish advisory and special assessments, such as the food dyes risks for children, as well as this particular study on synthetic turf fields. So the overall objective of the OEHHA turf study is to characterize the exposure and health risks to crumb rubber infill in synthetic turf fields. Considering the spectrum of field users, so multiple age groups of athletes, coaches, referees, and spectators, and considering turf fields of various ages and fields in different climate zones across the state, on multiple exposure routes as well, like inhalation, dermal, and oral, meaning that breathing, skin contact, and ingestion. Study of this magnitude and detail is only possible with synergistic research partnership. And in this particular case, it's with Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, LBNL, and California Institute of Quantitative Sciences at UCB, and UCB Center for Environmental Research and Children's Health, as well as the University of Arizona. As you will see, they're a critical role in many aspects of this study. And just as with the partnerships, Scientific peer review and interactions is also central to this project. The scientific advisory panel that I just listed here consisted of 7 experts in exposure science, analytical chemistry, environmental monitoring, biostatistics, public health, medicine, and children's health. These were Edward Awal, John Baums, Deborah Bennett, Sandy Akal, Amy Kyle, Tom McCone, and Linda Sheldon. I would also acknowledge at this point, before getting into the rest of the presentation, interactions with EPA, NTP, as well as European Chemical Agency, as well as input from the general public, player groups and parents, tire industry, as well as the field owners. Field owners, particularly, they were gracious. It was only because of them we could do this study and measurements in the field, as you will see. So with that intro, here are the topic areas that I'd like to cover in the rest of the talk. Chemicals of concern, the designation of chemicals as being field-related, turf field-related, then exposure parameters and assessment, health risk assessment, status of the study, and next steps to conclude the talk. So first, focusing on the chemicals of concern. In this study, 3 approaches were used, I think, which is logical as one would expect. It consisted of a literature search focusing on studies of synthetic fuels as well as crumb rubber, and then combined with outreach activities involving other agencies, industry, and public workshops. We also received information on chemicals used in tire manufacture from the U.S. Rubber Manufacturers Association, as well as the International Carbon Black Association. And then lab experiments and field measurements with Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, measuring chemicals emitted from the synthetic turf fields and also chemicals extracted from the crumb rubber samples. In 2 situations, one in terms of the pre-installed crumb samples, meaning that before being installed in the field, crumb rubber samples were extracted. Those were obtained from 4 waste tire recycling facilities in NorCal and SoCal and used in the extraction. And also, crumb rubber samples were obtained from the actual fields. So these were used to identify the chemicals of concern. So focusing on the field study, the measurements, sampling and measurements were done in 35 fields. I don't know if we have a pointer. If not, I thought about it, but then it's okay. If not, it's all right. Yeah, it's all right, sorry. So in terms of the field studies, the sampling were done in 35 fields in the state. The left shows the air sample to my left. Yeah, all the way to your left also, because I'm turning around. To my right, I have the crumb rubber samples. So crumb rubber samples here and air samples. So sampling were done both in the air, in the field, as well as the crumb rubber samples. So the air samples were obtained from multiple locations on the field and off the field at different times, with activity and without activity, meaning that players with and without, and also at different heights, from the field. Now, that allows to establish a concentration gradient of chemicals. If the chemicals are associated with the turf, then you'd be able to see a higher concentration closer to the field. So those measurements were done from that perspective. And the crumb rubber samples were also collected from the field, about 6 to 10 locations in each field of the 35 fields. And these were done, as I said, in 35 fields. In 5 climate regions covering. 33 of the play fields were in the coastal regions, southern, northern, and central, whereas the 2 covered the mountainous and southern high and low desert climate region as well. So these samples from the 35 fields, both the air samples and the crumb rubber infill samples, were analyzed with the state-of-the-art instruments to identify the chemicals. So in this study, we detected 119 chemicals on field, in the air. Consisted of semi-volatile organic chemicals and volatile organic chemicals, as well as aldehydes and ketones. And then in parallel, in the simulated physiological fluids were simulated sweat and simulated gastrointestinal fluid were used for extracting chemicals from the crumb rubber. So those fluids allow us to indicate what would be available and absorbed during an oral ingestion or during a dermal or skin contact. So in that part of the study, 31 metals were identified and 76 organic chemicals in the gastrointestinal biofluids and 75 of the 85 targeted chemicals in the dermal biofluids were identified or detected. And these were aldehydes, alkanes, alkenes, other oxygen-containing organics, fatty acid derivatives, phthalates, nitrogenated organics, and pHs. So in common, when you look at the GA biofluids and dermal biofluids, 70 were common to both of them, and then 6 were detected in the GA biofluid, whereas 5 others were detected in the dermal biofluids. So these were the chemicals of concern and the classes of concern. Then the next question is whether they are all field-related, particularly the ones you detect in the air. Are those field-related, or are those also commonly occurring air contaminants, or are we detecting both, or how do you differentiate them? So for the ones extracted from the crumb rubber infill, the question doesn't arise. That is essentially related to the crumb rubber or field-related, no question. So all of them were assumed to be field-related. Whereas for volatile organic chemicals and the aldehydes and ketones, we had to address that question. Those were the last 2 bullets. So for volatile organic chemicals, we looked at the concentration gradient, and if there was an inverted concentration gradient, then that was assumed to be field-related, or that was identified to be field-related, meaning that higher concentration closer to the field. So 29 of the volatile organics were identified so. And similarly, 7 out of the 11 aldehydes and ketones were identified to be, or assumed to be field-related as well. In that case, not only the concentration gradient was used, but in some cases, since that data wasn't available, we used the air monitoring data from the South Coast. The South Coast Air Quality Management District has the data on the background levels of air contaminants from the MATES study, which is the multiple air toxics exposure study for the South Coast Air Basin. So using those, we were able to compare whether the measured levels were over and above the background or how they compare with the background. So these were the considerations to be able to identify whether the chemicals were field-related or not. So chemicals of concern and which ones are field-related. Now, how do they get into the body? What are the exposure pathways? Inhalation for the vapors and particles, the dermal by skin contact. An ingestion pathway was considered for intentional and incidental ingestion of the synthetic turf chemicals, either through hand-to-mouth or hand-to-object-to-mouth or object-to-mouth kind of behaviors. But what is the rate of contact of these, and what is the type of behavior with these? Because those kinds of data and parameters would be essential to calculate the exposure for the various user groups. So in that context, for this study, time activity studies were conducted in collaboration with the UC Berkeley and University of Arizona of soccer players in the state of California to get parameters specific to the soccer players in the state, so that we get an idea of the frequency of games, types of uniforms, the hygiene practices, rates of contacts, and amounts of contacts, and so forth. So there are three types of time activity studies completed and used for this purpose. One was a field observational study with 40 soccer players using the virtual timing device, or the VTD, the videotaping. The second one is evaluating the archived video recording study of children playing on the turf and in playground settings. And finally, a survey of 1,069 field users, or who are the respondents to the survey. So using those data, we're able to analyze and come up with the exposure parameters. So now we have the chemicals of concern, their concentrations, whether they are field related, and now we also have the athlete-specific time activity data, and then we were able to proceed with the exposure assessment, which is calculating the dose or the level to which the various receptors are exposed, or various users are exposed to the chemicals. We did the exposure assessment calculations for 24 receptor categories, or age receptor categories, if you will, both on-field and off-field for these groups. So right from the third trimester fetus in pregnant people through the various age groups is 2 years, 2 to 6 to 11 to 16 years, and so forth. So when you look at the athletes, the age groups we considered went from 2 years to 70 years. Coaches goes from 16 years to 70, and referees from 16 to 70. Spectators, the entire spectrum of age groups, which represents the family and friends of athletes and others who would be watching the games. So we conducted the exposure calculation for all of these age groups. And the study, in terms of the exposure assessment, focused on 4 exposure metrics. One was 1 hour exposure concentrations. The 1 hour exposures reflect the short-term exposures during a game, if someone was there for a very short term during a game. And then we also compiled the one-day exposures, which reflects playing in one field or being present in one field during one day or for one game only. Also, average concentrations, accounting for the frequency of exposure, which means someone goes to many games to the same field or to different fields. So in those cases, we calculated the average in terms of average daily dose and lifetime average daily dose. These are the 2 dose metrics you would need, or one would normally use for calculating non-cancer hazards as well as the cancer risks. For cancer risks, it's the lifetime average daily dose, whereas the average daily dose was used for the non-cancer risk calculations. And the exposure calculations based on those metrics were done for 2 scenarios. The scenario 1 is an exposure across all fields. It's like a competitive athlete or a referee who travels and goes to all of the fields, So exposure happens in multiple fields, in many fields. The scenario 2 we did was to focus on calculations of exposure from an individual field, meaning that someone plays or an user that goes to one local field or a home field. An athlete that plays at a home field or a referee that just goes to the home field only. So 2 scenarios. One is the assessment for all the individual 35 fields. And the other one is an average for the entire set of fields, assuming that they travel across the fields and get exposed in all of the fields. For those 2 scenarios, calculations were made both for chronic toxicity and risk, as well as for one-day exposure in each field. So using the results of the exposure calculation, for making interpretation of the health risk, we would need the toxicity criteria. So we focused on 4, or this study focuses on 4 endpoints. One is the acute toxicity, which means 1 hour intermittent exposures resulting in acute effects. Second is developmental and reproductive toxicity. That's a one-time exposure which can result, during a sensitive endpoint. Now I'm getting mixed up with the words because I'm almost there. I have to finish. Developmental and reproductive toxicity, meaning that it could be a one-time exposure during a sensitive exposure window, and then chronic or repeated toxicity leading either to cancer or non-cancer health effects, such as effects on liver, kidney, nervous system, and so forth. So for doing that, we compiled the toxicity criteria from our own multiple programs at OEHHA, as well as from USEPA and ATSDR. But when the values were not available, such peer-reviewed and high-quality values were not available, we developed values during this study. For those without values, we did a literature search to develop new tox values, or we used structural analogy to develop values for others. So, where are we right now? We completed the sampling and analysis. So we got the on and off field sampling, targeted, non-targeted lab analysis, determination of field-related versus non-field-related chemicals have been done. Completed the toxicity assessment. The toxicity criteria have been compiled and new values have been developed for tire-related chemicals, which are essential for doing the risk assessment here. Completed the exposure analysis for the 24 age receptor groups based on the California-specific soccer player activity data, as I alluded to. And now we are wrapping up the risk assessment calculations, focusing on the acute effects, reproductive developmental effects, chronic effects, and cancer. And we are projecting to release the draft report next month, July 24, for review by the Scientific Advisory Panel, Synthetic Turf Scientific Advisory Panel, and the public review, followed by revision of the report based on the public input and panel input, then look forward to the release of the final report. With that, I thank you for your attention.
Okay, very good. All right, good morning, everyone, and thank you for staying through. I know lunch is next. Just to repeat, I'm Annette Giuseppe-Eli. I'm our National Program Director for the Chemical Safety for Sustainability Research Program at the Office of Research and Development at EPA. I'm very pleased to be here. This is my third visit to this meeting. I was here in 2017 when we first kicked off the FRAP, the Federal Research Action Plan on Recycled Tire Crumb Used on synthetic turf playing fields and playgrounds. And then I came back in 2019 to give a report on the first part of the activity, which was the exposure characterization of the tire crumb rubber itself. And now finally we've completed the study, and so we're here for releasing this version of the report. Okay, so I'm going the wrong direction. Okay, here we are. Okay, so obviously this has been a team effort, and there are lots of people involved. You'll see at the end the acknowledgements. But even as we do that, I wanted to make sure that we understood that this is a joint activity between the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, Office of Research and Development. Ken Thomas, Dr. Ken Thomas was our executive technical lead, and Jose was our project lead. And then we also had input from the CDC and ETSCR, Drs. Elizabeth Irvin and Angela Reagan-Wilson. And as a disclaimer, we always need to be sure that while the presentation was reviewed by the agencies, they represent the views of the authors and not necessarily those of the agency. Just to be quick, this is how we're going to cover it this morning. I'll give an overview of the Federal Research Action Plan itself. Then I'll go through a quick recap of the Tire Crumb Characterization Report, which was published in 2019, and then follow up with what we've just published recently the exposure characterization component with both the objectives and the approach, some results and some key findings, ending up with the overall conclusions for both Part 1 and Part 2. I know that some of you are aware of the Federal Research Action Plan, but just to give a background for everyone, it was sponsored by the EPA, ATSDR, CDC, ATSDR, and the Consumer Product Safety Commission, CPSC, launched in 2016, looking specifically at the crumb rubber in these synthetic turf fields and playgrounds where CPSC had the lead on the playgrounds, and we had the lead on the synthetic turf fields. EPA and ATSCR, like I said, released the crumb rubber characterization component in 2019. I'll go over that in a minute. And then followed by, we had a fair amount of activity leading up to all of this, leading up to that initial report in 2019, a very intensive set of field activities. And then, unfortunately, we had a COVID incident, and the result is that we had to put everything on hold. But following now the ATSCR completing a supplemental biomonitoring study, we have finalized the exposure characterization component, which is Part 2 of the report, back in April. And with these two reports now in hand, we think that we're finally complete. The report is it's fairly substantive, but I think I wanted to give the bottom line information up front. So bottom line about the playing fields, and this is in general about both Part 1 and Part 2. The conclusions that, as you would expect, if you were coming in contact with chemistry and the tire crumb rubber, you will come in contact with chemicals as expected. But what we have determined is that the exposure to these are likely to be fairly limited. And we base that on that conclusion on a series of very specific findings from both sets of activities. Generally, what we find is that only small amounts of most organic chemicals that are released into the air through emissions. So we do similarly measure emissions from air into air. And that for most analytes that were measured during active play at outdoor fields, the next to the field concentrations in air were not different from background, with a few exceptions, and particularly when you're indoors. For metals, which is our other key set of target analytes, only small fractions. Again, we did similar kinds of activities looking at gastric fluids and saliva and sweat. The average means were like less than 3% for the gastric fluids and less than 1% for saliva and sweat that were released from the tire crumb rubber into these simulated biological fluids. When you compare that to the default that we typically assume is 100%. And then we had the biomonitoring studies, which were done primarily by CDC, ATSDR, and some by NIOSH. In the biomonitoring pilot study, the concentrations for metals measured in blood or similar to those in the general population. And then when we went back into the supplemental biomonitoring study, we find no differences in polynuclear aromatic hydrocarbons, the pH metabolites in urine were observed between both study participants that were both on natural grass fields and in the synthetic turf fields. I'll also point to, I'm grateful that you showed the additional studies that were being done, because what we've found really is that these findings are really supportive of activities that we've seen through the Netherlands, RIVM, and OEHHA, who had done some studies in that 2017-19 timeframe that shows kind of low exposures, and they continue to use the fields. Plus the NTP study, of course, that had looked at the actual ingestion of the crumb rubber itself. All right. So we give a little bit of why we did this and with the research context. I think I've heard this in the course of this morning as well. There are a fair amount of fields out there that are using synthetic turf. It's on the order of about 1,800 to 1,900 in the US, with about 1,200 or 1,500 newer replacement fields each year. Most of the fields use the crumb rubber as the infill material. So the gentleman this morning mentioned some of the other alternative natural materials as well, but primarily we're looking at crumb rubber. And the fields are everywhere. They're in municipal and county parks, in schools, in colleges. And it never fails to amuse me that when you watch the professional games on the telly and you see them slide, you see the crumb rubber kind of pick up. But it's everywhere, and including in military installations. I will take a pause here to thank our military colleagues. About 50% of the fields that we sampled were with their help, so shout out to them at this point. Parents and athletes and schools, and they're everywhere, had raised concerns about potential health effects. You mentioned the particular study in Washington. And so in 2016, when we started this, we really thought that it was going to be one of those studies where we could do a fair amount of insights on exposure where this hadn't been done before. All right, a few caveats about the FRAP, different from the California study. We do have a memorandum of understanding with California, but our studies are different. The FRAP is not a risk assessment. We're not doing a risk assessment, nor can it inform a level at which you might see adverse health effects. Instead, what we did was focus on exposure, understanding exposure. What chemicals are in the material, and at what amounts, and how do people come in contact with that material. And since exposure, for any one of us who knows the foundational risk is a function of both hazard and exposure. If you don't have one, you don't have the other. We try to focus on the exposure component that could inform risk. And at the time, this was really one of the first studies that was being done in the US at this kind of comprehensive nature. This slide, and hopefully you can read some of what's on there, it's meant to be the last of the introductory type slides that gives you an idea of, we may be reporting here on the last of the exercise on the exposure characterization component, but a lot has gone in since then, and this summary slide, when you get it, will show all of the different activities and links to where those reports are, starting with literature search and data gaps analysis in 2016, published at the end of that year, the first year, the tire crumb characterization itself, then that was 2019, the exposure characterization that we're doing now, supplemental biomonitoring study that's part of this report, and a playground study that was done by CPSC that's also published and out there. So whereas we're going to, much of this is going to focus on the two reports that have been published, you have access to all of these, and they're available on our website. The crumb rubber characterization itself, like I said, was released in 2019. You've got links to it here. It was released in July of 2019. It's EPA and ATSCR looking at what's in the tire crumb itself. The report addresses what is in the crumb rubber and how people come in contact with it. But this component really just focuses on chemical constituents, microbiological activity, organic emissions, metal bioaccessibility for the crumb samples. And they were collected on a range, whereas California is California, and they've got the 35 sites across California. This one was, we actually took materials from the recycling plants themselves, 9 recycling plants across the US, 40 synthetic turf fields across the US as well. And bottom up results up front, in general, again, not unexpected. We found a range of chemicals in the material, both metals and organics, and all fields tested positive for bacteria. The chemical concentrations were generally similar to those that were reported in other studies, and bacteria was found on very similar to those reported on typical household articles. So while there was a wide range of chemicals that were present in air emissions, the bioaccessibility of materials themselves in biological fluids of metals particularly were low. And that leads us to this report that we've just published in April of this year. It addresses how people come in contact with the material associated with the crumb rubber, and you've got the link for it here. So the backdrop for this really is the fact that when we did that data gaps analysis back in 2016, 17, what we were finding is that from those published literature review and studies, there was very specific exposure data gaps. Limited exposure for human health assessments, limited characterization of particularly of dermal and ingestion exposure pathways, limited biomonitoring, and then very small sample size. So the overall research purpose then became to characterize exposures of how people are exposed to the chemical compounds found in the recycled crumb rubber based on their activity specifically on synthetic turf fields. So here the summary of the things that we've completed as part of the exposure characterization component itself. We did field user activity questionnaires where we had about 32 child and adult participants. We did a pilot study of exposure measurements and biomonitoring during and around play and practice on the fields. In this instance, rather than all 40, we did 3 fields very specifically with 25 participants total, with 14 of them being followed up with biomonitoring. And then more recently, as I mentioned, it took a while, like I said, because of COVID. A lot of this has to go through OMB review. So it's a matter of getting clearance to do it first, but then actually being able to go out in the field is what took the time because of the COVID pandemic. They just recently completed that supplemental biomonitoring study. They did 132 players on synthetic turf fields, but they also went back and looked at players on natural grass fields. And similarly, we did, to California, we did these micro activities. It's what gets you with exposure assessment. How many times does the person put their hands to their mouth, objects to their mouth, hand to the turf, those kinds of things. So we've done both video, curated materials, as well as participants on the field. And here we've got a total of 60 participants, both from the publicly available videos, as well as from the study participant itself. And in addition, we did do some actual exposure modeling for 6 chemicals, some of the more typical kinds of chemicals that you would expect in the crumb rubber. Right, so here are the findings from part 2, which will look sort of similar to the overall findings. Unexpectedly, we find that a range of chemicals, including both metals and organics, was found in the air, the field surface, the field dust, and in the dermal exposure media. And field and dermal measurements indicate that people do come in contact with these if they're associated with the crumb rubber material on the fields. But overall, what we're finding is that we expect it to be very low. And there are numbers in the report that you can go back and look and see how those are defined. And then for many of the analytes that were measured during active play at the turf fields, that next to the field air concentrations were pretty much not very much different than background, although in some instances, particularly indoor, they were a little bit higher. For the study participants, this is the primary study, the metal in blood and serum or urinary pHs were similar before and after field activities, with some exceptions. You see the 2-hydroxynaphthalene, and it's consistent with what they're finding in the general population. And then the supplemental biomonitoring study, part 2, which is in Appendix A of this report, it further shows that that initial findings can be more generally relatable to both study participants on both grass fields and synthetic turf fields. So we're not seeing a difference between the 2 sets of populations. All right, really briefly, there's a fair amount of technical detail in these reports, but I wanted to show you just kind of briefly what some of the details. This is a schematic of one of the fields that was sampled. We sampled 3 fields, like I said, 2 outdoors and 1 indoor. We were particularly concerned about high temperatures on these fields. And so you see there the air temperature is on the order of about 90 degrees. The field surface temperature is more like 100. So we're trying really hard to make sure that we we kind of get at what's in the material actually being volatilized and being accessible. The fields itself, you see there are a couple of air sample stations that are related to the field, another air sample that's to the right that shows sort of like the wind direction, so that shows you where the background is, so you can see both from the field and from the background. And then on the field itself, we took samples from a number of locations, and these included things like surface wipes, something called a drag sled, where you slide the item across the field to get the samples itself. So air, dermal, and field samples as well. Here are analyte lists, and these are done primarily from our literature reviews. We have target analytes that are out there, 21 targeted metals, typical kinds of things like lead and zinc and chromium, and those were sampled in dust, air, surface wipes, and dermal media. And in semi-volatiles, there were 40 of these, things like the pHs and the phthalates in air, dust, surface wipes, the drag sled, and the medium, and then VOCs in the air, things like methyl, ethyl, ketone, and styrene, and so on. We did try to do some personal samples, air sampling with personal monitors. Unfortunately, that did not work very well, so we don't have those personal samples, but we were much more successful in the dermal wipes, hands, arms, and legs, and looking at metals and SVOCs in those pieces. So that's, like I said, there's a fair amount of detail in the reports of how these were done and what the results are. The next key thing I wanted to be sure to mention was on the biomonitoring component. That pilot study was conducted where they had pre- and post-activity urine and blood samples collected from the 3 fields. The whole blood was analyzed for some metals, as you see here, cadmium, mercury, selenium, and the serum was analyzed for copper and selenium and zinc. The urine was sampled for metabolites of pHs, the naphthalene and fluorine and so on. And then post this, the CDC went back and did, like I said, that supplemental study where they looked at 132 folks on the synthetic turf fields and 29 on the grass fields, and they looked at urine and analyzed for the metabolites of the pHs. And here are the results from the supplemental. Both the pre- and post-activity difference were not associated with the field type. The synthetic turf fields and crumb rubber and the natural fields seem to give you similar kinds of results. And then the results for the pre- and post-activity for the metabolites varied a little bit by statistical methods, but the post-activity concentration being relevant, being predicted by the pre-activity. And then with the exception of the 2-hydroxy naphthalene, the pre-activity pHs were lower than those in the general population. So I think I have general overall conclusions now. Just to reemphasize that what we're seeing really does suggest that if you have chemistry and you're exposed to it, you are going to be exposed to chemicals from these turf fields. But everything that we've sort of done suggests that the exposures are limited and are repeating. Generally, the only small amounts of the organic chemicals were released into air through emissions, where many of the analytes measured during actively at the outdoor fields, the next to the field concentrations were not different in background. And then for metals, we're finding that only small fractions with average means less than about 3% for gastric fluids and less than 1% for the saliva and sweat are released from the crumb rubber into the simulated biological fluids. In the biomonitoring pilot study, concentrations of metal measured in blood were similar to those in the general population, and then no differences were seen between the pH metabolites in urine in that supplemental biomonitoring study between participants on the natural grass fields as well as those on the synthetic turf fields. Some additional considerations I wanted to be sure that got into here. Supporting what we've just found with these studies that were done earlier by the the Dutch Institute, RIVM. We did interact as they were carrying out their study. They were able to do it a whole lot quicker than we are, and I'll point to that. We do have to go through a fair amount of regulatory review with the Office of Management and Budget before you can go out and do any of these studies in the field. But by the time we finish, we're finding that they are very supportive of both the OEHHA study and the RIVM study, and the NTP that had actually done gavage injection studies with the crumb rubber itself for these materials. All right, so that's pretty much it. I did say that there was a large team that was involved here, the range of contributing authors, all other folks that contributed to the study, our reviewers, including a number of folks from the other offices and across EPA and the regions and the Army Public Health. Special thanks, like I said, to CPSC, the Defense Centers for Public Health, and other collaborators, not the least of which being our California colleagues. And here's the contact information if you need it. All right.
Okay, at this time, we have about 10 minutes for questions, so please raise your hand. We'll run a mic to you.
Thanks for that talk, or both talks. And I was curious about the level of bacteria that you found. And I know you said it was similar to other household objects. One of the things that we've heard is that quaternary and ammonium compounds are often used to disinfect the fields. Could you talk about when you sampled bacteria in regards to when those fields might have been treated with those?
Yeah, I suspect I can't, because I don't think that we had a sort of review of what was going on in terms of sanitizing the fields. I don't think that was ever an issue that was raised. But when you look at it, and not a microbiologist, which is why there are so many contributors and contributing authors on this paper, we can certainly look, but I doubt that was a characteristic that was identified before actually looking at the fields. But it pretty much what it's like almost everywhere you've got some bacteria.
Basic question for Dr. Krishnan. When the study is released, how can the public access that study?
I think it is on. Yeah. In our website, there's or maybe I can put it up. There's one that's specific to the turf study in the OEHHA website. That's where all of the science advisory panel meetings, the videos, and the slides presented in each one of the studies, the study design, all of them are there. And with the release, you would certainly have the listserv announcement and link to that site as well.
I have two questions for both studies. One is, how did you guys select the fields? Did you look at different fields, ages, or conditions? I would imagine if a field is older, it's kind of at the end of its life, might have more crumb rubber. And also, did you guys see differences whether the soccer players were, male or female players? And last question, I guess, is, I don't know if you looked at, if you can go to the level of detail of if you played a particular position in the team, was their exposure, like if you were a goalie, you were exposed a little bit more than if you're midfield or something like that?
I was gonna look at the number of fields. I know the The age of the fields is covered from about new up to, I think, 19 years old, I think. That's the range of the age of the fields in up to 35 fields that I'm referring to in California. The results I know have been presented for the combined genders, so I could not specify, but I would have to talk to my team to see whether gender-specific calculations have been conducted, but yeah. What was the other one?
This is for you also.
Yeah.
Our industry is waiting anxiously for the report, and when you said it's going to be finished in July, how long then before you might put it on listserv? Is it a couple of months? Is it a month? So we get to, you've had the meetings where we get to go sit and listen to a panel and we get to review it, or are you just going to send it out for us to review it? Will it just be posted and no meeting, just to be clear? Previously, we've had meetings where we got to go sit and listen to you guys present.
The draft report, it's released to the public and to the panel, and there'll be a panel meeting after that. Usually about a month, I would say, between the release and the panel meeting.
Okay.
And there'll be time for public comments on the report before it's finalized. General process without
If we could just go back to the previous question. I don't think Annette had a chance to respond to that one.
I can remember one part of the question, that was about the age of the fields, and we certainly did. The fields were chosen with not necessarily a rigorous statistical design, so we can't do that, but we did choose the 4 fields from the 4 different quadrants of the country, so it's across all 4 quadrants of the country, and with fields of different ages. Not to say that we did, like I said, a rigorous design that way. The pooling, the number of participants is modest, so you can't do very much. I think we were able to make distinctions between adults and children. We don't have the discriminating to do between different positions on the field. Trying to recruit people is not always the easiest thing to do, but we do have that kind of information that's listed, being able to discriminate other than, I think, adults and children, and particularly with hand-to-mouth kinds of activities we can do. Thanks.
Yeah, maybe one more specific addition to my answer is that our compilation shows there are 907 fields in the state of California, up to 19 years old as the age of the fields, and 4% have been sampled as part of this study. No, that's the 35 fields, covering the 5 climate regions.
Okay, I think that basically concludes our session. Big thank you to the panelists.